Zixtal flicked his crystalline tail in annoyance as the transport shuttle descended toward the third planet of the Sol system. The teenage Velthari had been looking forward to this cultural exchange program until he learned their first stop would be some boring human memorial site. His iridescent scales shifted from deep purple to an irritated orange as he stared out the viewport at the blue-green world below. "Why couldn't we visit the human entertainment districts first?" he muttered to his clutchmate Rixvin, who sat beside him reviewing their itinerary on a holographic display. "Or their technology centers? Instead, we get to stare at old dead humans." Rixvin's scales maintained their neutral blue coloring, a sign of his more diplomatic nature. The Cultural Ministry believes understanding human history and traditions is essential for proper relations. The humans specifically requested we visit this location first. "Their death obsession is so primitive," Zixtal scoffed, his elongated neck craning to look at the other students in their group. Most of the dozen young Velthari seemed equally unimpressed by their destination. "My father says humans are barely evolved past their savage origins. They still worship violence and conflict." Their instructor, Elder Kesserel, approached from the front of the shuttle. Her ancient scales had faded to a dignified silver, and her eyes held the wisdom of someone who had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. "We are approaching the Arlington National Cemetery," she announced to the group. "I remind you all that this is a sacred site to the humans. You will show appropriate respect." Zixtal rolled his eyes, a gesture he had learned from human entertainment broadcasts. Respect for what? Moldering bones? The humans lost most of their major conflicts anyway. The Galactic Historical Database shows they've been defeated more often than they've won. Elder Kesserel's gaze fixed on him with disapproval. "Your father's influence has clearly shaped your perspective, young Zixtal. But you would do well to remember that these defeated humans are now one of the most influential species in the Galactic Council. Perhaps there is more to their history than surface records suggest." The shuttle touched down on a designated landing pad near the cemetery's entrance. Through the viewports, Zixtal could see the human settlement spread out in orderly rows of white stone markers, stretching across rolling green hills. It looked exactly as boring as he had expected. The air outside appeared clean enough, though the gravity would be slightly heavier than his homeworld. As they disembarked, a human delegation waited to greet them. At the front stood a tall woman in what their briefing materials had identified as military dress uniform. Her dark skin contrasted sharply with the crisp white and blue fabric, and her posture radiated authority despite her species' relatively small stature compared to the Velthari. "Welcome to Arlington National Cemetery," she said, her voice carrying easily across the group despite speaking at normal volume. "I am Colonel Martinez, and I'll be your guide today. Before we begin our tour, I want you to understand what this place represents to our people." Zixtal tuned out most of the explanation, instead focusing on the strange human customs he observed. Several humans in civilian clothing moved through the cemetery carrying colorful plants, which they placed near various stone markers. Others stood silently before certain graves, some with moisture leaking from their optical organs. Such an inefficient emotional response, he thought. The group followed Colonel Martinez along paved pathways between the grave markers. Each white stone bore inscriptions in the human's primitive alphabet, along with dates and symbols Zixtal didn't recognize or care to learn about. The colonel stopped periodically to explain the significance of certain areas, but Zixtal found his attention wandering to the impressive skyline of the human capital city, visible in the distance. "The tomb of the unknown soldier represents our commitment to honor all who have served, even those whose names have been lost to history," Colonel Martinez was explaining as they approached a white marble structure. "The guards here maintain a constant vigil, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, regardless of weather conditions." Zixtal perked up slightly when he saw the human standing motionless beside the tomb. The guard wore an elaborate uniform and held an archaic projectile weapon with a blade attached. His movements were precise and mechanical as he paced back and forth in a predetermined pattern. Every few moments he would stop, turn, and resume his march in the opposite direction. "How long has this particular guard been standing there?" asked Rixvin, showing more interest than Zixtal thought the display deserved. "Sergeant Rodriguez began his shift at 800 hours, Colonel Martinez replied. "He will continue until relieved at 1,000 hours, maintaining absolute silence and precision throughout his watch." Zixtal snorted, a sound that unfortunately carried further in the Earth atmosphere than he had intended. Several members of their group turned to look at him, and he noticed a few humans nearby doing the same. The guard, however, remained completely motionless except for his measured steps. "Something troubles you about this tradition?" Elder Kesral asked quietly, her scales shifting to a warning yellow. "It's just so pointless," Zixtal replied, not bothering to lower his voice, standing there like a statue guarding an empty box. "What's the purpose? The dead don't need protection, and any real threat would easily overcome one soldier with an ancient weapon." Colonel Martinez's expression remained neutral, but Zixtal caught a subtle tension in her posture. "The purpose is not tactical defense," she said carefully. "It's about honor, remembrance, and the unbroken commitment of the living to those who sacrificed everything for our freedom." "Honor to failures," Zixtal muttered, his scales brightening to an arrogant gold. "Your species' history is filled with defeats and setbacks. Why celebrate mediocrity?" The words had barely left his mouth when he realized the entire area had gone completely silent. Not just their group, but every human within hearing distance had stopped what they were doing. Even the ambient sounds of the city seemed muted. For the first time since arriving on Earth, Zixtal felt a chill that had nothing to do with the planet's atmospheric conditions. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Zixtal became acutely aware of dozens of human eyes focused on him, their expressions ranging from shock to barely contained anger. Even his fellow Velthari students had gone completely still, their scales shifting to nervous patterns of gray and brown. Colonel Martinez stepped closer, her voice dropping to a tone that somehow managed to be both quiet and utterly commanding. "Young being, you clearly don't understand what you're witnessing here. This guard has maintained his post through hurricanes, blizzards, and temperatures that would challenge most species' survival. He will not break his vigil for anything short of a direct threat to this sacred ground." Zixtal's adolescent pride flared, his scales brightening further to an almost blinding gold. The attention was intoxicating, even if it wasn't the admiring kind he usually sought. "Sacred to whom? You're treating a simple human soldier like some kind of deity. In Velthari culture, we honor actual achievements, not symbolic gestures." "Zixtal," Elder Kesral hissed, her own scales now flashing warning colors of red and black. "You will cease this behavior immediately." But the teenager was beyond listening to reason. The strange human silence, rather than intimidating him, seemed to fuel his rebellious nature. "No, I want to understand this primitive ritual. If this guard is so dedicated, so unbreakable, let's test that theory." Before anyone could stop him, Zixtal darted forward with the natural speed of his species. His elongated limbs carried him past the barrier rope in a fluid motion that caught everyone off guard. Within seconds, he stood directly in front of the tomb guard, well within the restricted area. The human soldier, Sergeant Rodriguez, continued his measured pace, as if Zixtal didn't exist. His eyes remained fixed forward, his expression unchanged, his grip on the ceremonial rifle unwavering. The young Velthari found this complete lack of reaction somehow insulting. "Hey," Zixtal said, waving one of his forearms directly in front of the guard's face. "I'm talking to you." "Acknowledge me." "Nothing." The guard simply continued his routine, turning at the appropriate moment and beginning his march in the opposite direction. Zixtal had to step aside to avoid being walked into, but even then the human showed no sign of recognition. The crowd of humans around the tomb had grown larger, but they maintained their eerie silence. Some held communication devices, apparently recording the incident. Others simply watched with expressions of disbelief and growing anger. Yet none of them moved to intervene directly. "This is ridiculous," Zixtal announced, his voice echoing off the marble surfaces. "You're all standing around worshipping someone who won't even defend himself. Watch this." He reached out with one clawed hand and deliberately knocked the guard's ceremonial cap from his head. The white hat tumbled to the ground, landing near the tomb itself. The reaction was immediate and electric. A collective gasp rose from the assembled humans, followed by angry murmurs and shouts. Someone called out, "Security!" while others demanded the alien be arrested immediately. But Sergeant Rodriguez simply completed his current pace, stopped at his turning point, and continued his march. However, Zixtal noticed something that made his scales flicker with uncertainty. The guard's jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly, and there was a slight tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. But still, the human said nothing and did nothing to retaliate. "Incredible," Zixtal said, turning to address the crowd. You see? Even when directly challenged, your mighty guardian does nothing. This is what you call honor? This is pathetic weakness disguised as tradition. Colonel Martinez had pushed through the crowd and now stood at the edge of the restricted area, her face a mask of controlled fury. Step away from the tomb immediately. You have no idea what you're doing or what forces you're playing with. Forces? Zixtal laughed, the sound carrying an unfortunate resemblance to the mating call of Earth's native geese. What forces? One stubborn human who's too afraid to break character even when insulted? Your entire species is like this, isn't it? All ceremony and tradition, no substance. Elder Kesserol had reached the barrier as well, her ancient voice carrying absolute authority. Zixtal, by the sacred bonds of our ancestors, I command you to cease this disgraceful behavior and return to the group immediately. But Zixtal was intoxicated by the attention and the apparent powerlessness of the humans to stop him. He had crossed a line and found that nothing terrible had happened. The guard continued his meaningless routine. The humans continued their impotent watching, and he remained in complete control of the situation. One more test, he announced, bending down to pick up the guard's fallen cap. Let's see how committed this human really is to his precious duty. Instead of returning the hat, Zixtal held it aloft like a trophy. I think I'll keep this as a souvenir, a reminder of the day I proved that human honor is just an empty performance. This time the crowd's reaction was immediate and vocal. Angry shouts erupted from all directions, and several humans began pushing toward the barrier. Colonel Martinez spoke rapidly into a communication device, calling for additional security. The other Velthari students huddled together in obvious distress, their scales cycling through every shade of embarrassment and fear. But Sergeant Rodriguez simply continued his march. 21 measured steps in each direction, turn, pause, repeat. His face remained expressionless, his posture perfect, his commitment absolute despite the chaos erupting around him. Zixtal felt a moment of doubt as he watched the guard's unwavering discipline. There was something unsettling about such complete self-control in the face of direct provocation. In Velthari culture, honor meant fighting back when challenged. This human response was different, alien in a way that made his scales twitch with unease. Sir, a new voice called out, and Zixtal turned to see a human in a different uniform approaching rapidly. The man's insignia marked him as senior military, and his expression suggested this situation was about to escalate significantly. General Hayes. Colonel Martinez saluted crisply. We have an incident with one of the alien students. General Hayes surveyed the scene with eyes that had clearly seen combat. When his gaze fixed on Zixtal, the young alien felt something he'd never experienced before, the attention of a true predator. Colonel, please inform our guests that they have approximately 30 seconds to retrieve their student and depart this area before I authorize whatever response I deem appropriate to protect the dignity of this sacred ground. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and for the first time since arriving on Earth, Zixtal began to suspect he might have made a serious error in judgment. General Hayes didn't raise his voice, but somehow every human in the area heard him clearly. Sergeant Rodriguez, you are relieved of duty for emergency consultation. Report to the relief station. For the first time since Zixtal had been watching, the guard broke his routine. With crisp, precise movements, Sergeant Rodriguez performed a perfect about-face and marched toward a small building adjacent to the tomb. His departure was as measured and dignified as his vigil had been. But Zixtal caught something in the human's eyes as he passed, not anger, but a deep, profound disappointment that somehow felt worse than fury. Now then, General Hayes continued, turning his attention to the young Velthari, who still clutched the ceremonial cap. You seem to be under several fundamental misunderstandings about what you've just witnessed and what you've just done. Elder Kesserol approached the barrier, her scales now showing the deep black of profound shame. General Hayes, on behalf of the Velthari Educational Council, I offer our most sincere apologies. Zixtal's behavior is inexcusable and does not represent our people's values. Understood, Elder. But I think your student needs to learn exactly what he's interfered with before we discuss consequences. The general's gaze never left Zixtal, who was beginning to feel significantly less confident about his actions. Young alien, do you know what the tomb of the unknown soldier represents? Zixtal's scales flickered between their previous arrogant gold and a more uncertain amber. It's a grave for some human soldier whose name was lost. Colonel Martinez already explained that. That's the simplest explanation, yes, but you've missed the deeper meaning entirely. General Hayes stepped closer to the barrier, and Zixtal noticed that despite the human's smaller stature, his presence seemed to fill the entire space. This tomb doesn't contain just one soldier. It represents every human who died fighting for something larger than themselves, whose sacrifice was so complete that they couldn't even be identified. The general's voice took on a tone that made even the background noise of the city seem to fade. That guard you just humiliated has spent months training for the honor of standing watch here. He's memorized the names of thousands of fallen soldiers, studied military history until he could recite battle details in his sleep, and conditioned his body to maintain perfect form regardless of physical discomfort or weather conditions. Zixtal felt his grip on the cap loosening slightly. But why? What's the practical purpose? Because some things matter more than practical purpose, Colonel Martinez interjected, her voice carrying an edge of steel. Sergeant Rodriguez wasn't just standing guard. He was maintaining a promise made by the living to the dead, that their sacrifice would never be forgotten, never be diminished, never be treated as meaningless. General Hayes nodded approvingly. Every movement, every step, every moment of that vigil is performed with absolute precision, because anything less would dishonor those who gave everything. The guard's discipline isn't weakness. It's the highest form of strength our species recognizes. For the first time, Zixtal looked around at the assembled humans with something approaching awareness. Their earlier silence hadn't been the passive acceptance he'd assumed. It had been the restraint of people who understood exactly what they were witnessing and were giving him an opportunity to recognize his mistake before they responded. But the historical records show humans losing most of their major conflicts, Zixtal protested weakly, though his scales were now shifting toward the dull brown of uncertainty. Define victory, General Hayes said simply. When humans fought the Velthari Empire during the border wars 60 years ago, we lost every major engagement. Your people's superior technology and numbers overwhelmed our forces consistently. By traditional military measures, we were utterly defeated. Zixtal nodded, his confidence returning slightly. This matched what his father had taught him about human inferiority. And yet, the general continued, those crushing defeats led to the Treaty of Alpha Centauri, which established the principles of species equality that now govern the Galactic Council. Human willingness to continue fighting even in the face of certain defeat forced your empire to realize that conquest would cost more than cooperation. The young Velthari's scales flickered with confusion. That doesn't make sense. How can losing achieve victory? Because humans don't fight just to win, Colonel Martinez explained. We fight for principles, for ideas, for the future we want to leave our children. Sometimes the most important victories come from showing others what we're willing to die for. Elder Kesseral approached Zixtal, her ancient eyes reflecting a new understanding. Your father taught you to measure worth by immediate success, didn't he? But these humans measure themselves by different standards entirely. General Hayes gestured toward the tomb. Every person buried in this cemetery chose to place something larger than themselves above their own survival. That guard you mocked just demonstrated the same principle. His duty to the dead was more important than his personal dignity or comfort. But he didn't fight back, Zixtal said, though his voice now carried confusion rather than arrogance. In Velthari culture, honor means responding to challenges. Human honor is different, the general replied. Sometimes it means fighting when others won't. Sometimes it means not fighting when others would. Sergeant Rodriguez showed perfect discipline because breaking his vigil to address a disrespectful child would have been exactly the wrong response. New voice joined the conversation as Sergeant Rodriguez approached from the relief station. His replacement had already taken position at the tomb, maintaining the unbroken watch. Permission to speak, sir? Granted, Sergeant. Rodriguez looked directly at Zixtal, and the young alien saw something in the human's eyes that made his scales shift to deep purple. Not hatred, not anger, but something far more complex. A mixture of disappointment, pity, and genuine sorrow. Sir, I've stood that post through ice storms and heat waves, through crowds of thousands and completely alone in the middle of the night. I've maintained my vigil while mourning families wept at my feet, and while protesters screamed inches from my face. I've never broken discipline, never faltered, never allowed personal discomfort to interfere with my duty. The sergeant's voice remained perfectly level, but Zixtal could hear the weight of deep conviction behind every word. But in all my time as a guard, I've never felt the presence of the fallen more strongly than I did when you took my cap. It was as if every soul resting in this ground was asking me why I wasn't protecting their memory from being mocked. Zixtal's scales had now shifted to the deep gray of profound unease. I didn't realize— No, you didn't, Rodriguez agreed. You saw a human standing still and assumed that meant weakness. You couldn't recognize strength that doesn't announce itself with violence or aggression. That's not entirely your fault. Different species, different understanding. But ignorance doesn't excuse disrespect. General Hayes stepped forward again. Sergeant, I believe our young friend here is beginning to understand that his actions had consequences beyond what he imagined. The question now is what he plans to do about it. Zixtal clutched the ceremonial cap tighter, but now it felt heavy in his hands. Weighted with significance he was only beginning to grasp. What do you want me to do? General Hayes exchanged a glance with Colonel Martinez before responding. First, you're going to return Sergeant Rodriguez's cap with an appropriate apology. Then, if you're genuinely interested in understanding what you've just interfered with, I'm going to show you something that might change your perspective on human military tradition. The young Velthari approached Sergeant Rodriguez hesitantly, his scales cycling through uncertain patterns. I apologize for taking your hat. I didn't understand what it meant. Rodriguez accepted the cap with dignity, examining it briefly before placing it back on his head with practiced precision. Understanding is the first step toward respect. Thank you for returning it. General Hayes gestured toward a nearby building. Follow me. All of you. I think this entire group needs to learn something about human military heritage before you continue your cultural exchange program. As they walked, Colonel Martinez fell into step beside Elder Kesseral. General Hayes served in the border wars against your people. He lost most of his unit in the Battle of Kepler Station. The elderly Velthari's scales shifted to deep blue, a color indicating solemn respect. I remember those reports. The human garrison was outnumbered 50-1. They could have surrendered with honor. They could have, Martinez agreed. They chose not to. Inside the building, General Hayes led them to a room filled with displays, holographic projectors, and archived recordings. The walls were lined with photographs of humans in various military uniforms, spanning centuries of their species' development. Computer, display the Kepler Station engagement, tactical overview, the general commanded. A three-dimensional hologram materialized in the center of the room, showing a space station surrounded by a massive Velthari fleet. The human position looked impossibly small in comparison, a few dozen ships against hundreds of alien vessels. The Battle of Kepler Station, General Hayes began, his voice taking on the tone of a seasoned instructor. Strategic importance, minimal. The station controlled a minor shipping route and had no significant military value. Velthari Command expected us to evacuate or surrender within hours. Zixtal studied the hologram, his scales shifting to interested yellow. Why didn't you? The tactical situation was hopeless. Because retreat wasn't just about that one station, the general explained. Computer, expand to show the surrounding systems. The hologram zoomed out, revealing dozens of star systems with human colonies, trade routes, and defensive positions. If we abandoned Kepler without a fight, it would signal to your empire that humans would retreat from any overwhelming force. Every colony, every outpost, every civilian population would become a target. Elder Kesseral stepped closer to the display, her ancient eyes reflecting the holographic light. So you chose to make a statement. We chose to demonstrate human resolve, General Hayes corrected. Computer, show the human defensive strategy. The hologram shifted to show the human ships arranged in what appeared to be a suicide formation, directly between the Velthari fleet and the station. Admiral Chen's strategy was simple. Make every meter of space cost the Velthari more than they were willing to pay. Rixven, who had remained silent throughout most of the exchange, spoke up. But you couldn't possibly have expected to win. Victory wasn't measured in ships destroyed or territory held, Colonel Martinez interjected. Computer, display casualty reports and tactical analysis. New data streams appeared alongside the hologram. Zixtal read the numbers with growing amazement. The human fleet had been annihilated within 6 hours exactly as predicted. But those 6 hours had cost the Velthari significantly more than expected. Every human ship that was destroyed took an average of 3 Velthari vessels with it, General Hayes noted. Your commanders had expected a quick, clean victory with minimal losses. Instead, they faced opponents who fought with such desperation and skill that victory became Pyrrhic. The hologram showed the final moments of the battle. Human ships ramming Velthari cruisers. Human fighters making suicide runs against capital ships, the station itself detonating in a massive explosion that took out an entire wing of the alien fleet. But the real victory came afterward, the general continued. Computer, show the political aftermath. The display shifted to show communication intercepts, diplomatic exchanges, and strategic reassessments from Velthari High Command. Zixtal watched in fascination as his people's leadership grappled with the implications of what they had witnessed. If this is how humans fight for an unimportant outpost, one recorded message read, "What will they do when we threaten their core worlds? The cost of conquest may exceed the value of victory." Elder Kezerel's scales had shifted to the deep purple of profound reflection. I remember the debates in the Imperial Council. The Admiralty was shaken by how fiercely your people fought for what appeared to be an insignificant position. It wasn't insignificant to us, General Hayes replied. Every human life lost there had meaning. Every sacrifice was honored. And every enemy who witnessed their deaths understood something fundamental about our species. Zixtal found himself staring at one particular image, a young human pilot, probably not much older than himself, smiling from the cockpit of a fighter craft. The notation beneath read, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, KIA Kepler Station, posthumously awarded Medal of Honor for ramming action against Velthari command ship. She was Admiral Chen's daughter, Colonel Martinez said quietly, noticing Zixtal's focus. Volunteered for the mission despite her father's objections. Her sacrifice disabled the enemy flagship and allowed the station's final gambit to succeed. She chose to die for a strategic position that couldn't be held? Zixtal asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She chose to die for an idea, General Hayes corrected. The idea that some things matter more than individual survival. That freedom, dignity, and the right to exist on our own terms are worth any price. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Zixtal looked around at the photographs on the walls. Thousands of human faces representing thousands of similar choices across centuries of conflict. The guard at the tomb, he said slowly, pieces beginning to fit together in his mind. He's honoring all of them. Every single one, Sergeant Rodriguez confirmed, having joined them quietly. Every human who chose duty over safety, principle over survival, service over self. When I stand that post, I carry their memory with me. But how do you maintain that discipline? Rixven asked, his own scales shifting to curious yellow. How do you stand motionless for hours knowing you're being watched, tested, sometimes mocked? Rodriguez smiled slightly. Because they're watching too. Every soldier who ever gave their life for something greater than themselves. How could I dishonor their memory by breaking discipline over personal discomfort or pride? Zixtal felt something fundamental shifting in his understanding. In my culture, honor means fighting back when challenged. But for you, honor means keeping faith with those who came before us, General Hayes finished. Sometimes that requires fighting. Sometimes it requires not fighting. Sometimes it requires standing perfectly still while alien teenagers test your commitment. The young Velthari's scales had shifted to a deep, thoughtful blue. I think I'm beginning to understand why the Galactic Council respects humans so much. Despite your losses in major conflicts. Are they really losses? Elder Kesserol asked gently. If they achieve something more valuable than military victory? General Hayes gestured toward another section of the room where a massive holographic display showed the Earth's surface, marked with thousands of glowing points. Computer, display global memorial sites and their significance. The display zoomed in to reveal each point represented a cemetery, monument, or memorial dedicated to fallen soldiers. The sheer number was staggering. Tens of thousands of sites across every continent. This is just Earth, Colonel Martinez explained. Every human colony, every space station, every settlement maintains similar memorials. We carry our honored dead with us wherever we go. Zixtal studied the display with growing amazement. There are so many. How does your species function with such a burden of memory? It's not a burden, Sergeant Rodriguez said firmly. It's our strength. Every memorial represents lessons learned, prices paid, and promises kept. They remind us who we are and what we stand for. Elder Kesrel approached one of the smaller displays showing detailed records from Arlington Cemetery itself. According to this data, over 400,000 individuals are buried here, spanning multiple centuries of conflict. 400,000 stories, General Hayes confirmed. 400,000 people who chose to serve something larger than themselves. And the unknown soldier in that tomb could be any one of them, or someone whose remains were never even recovered. A new voice joined the conversation as an elderly human woman entered the room. Despite her advanced age and civilian clothing, she carried herself with unmistakable military bearing. "General Hayes," she said, offering a crisp salute that the general returned immediately. "I heard we had distinguished visitors learning about the tomb." Sergeant Major Williams retired. The general introduced her to the group. 30 years of active service, including 3 tours during the Centauri campaign. She now serves as a volunteer educator here at Arlington. Williams studied the Velthari group with sharp eyes before focusing on Zixtal. "You're the young one who interfered with the guard duty?" Zixtal's scales flushed with embarrassment. "Yes, ma'am, I didn't understand what I was doing." "Understanding comes with experience," Williams said, her tone neither harsh nor gentle. "Let me share something that might help." Computer, access personal files, Williams, Marcus, KIA Normandy campaign. A new holographic display materialized, showing a young human male in military uniform. The resemblance to the elderly woman was unmistakable. "My great-grandfather," Williams explained, "died in one of Earth's ancient wars, centuries before humans ever left their home system. His body was never recovered from the battlefield. For all we know, his remains could be in that tomb we're discussing." The display showed battlefield footage from humanity's distant past, primitive by galactic standards, but depicting the same willingness to sacrifice that Zixtal had witnessed in the more recent battle records. "Marcus Williams was 19 when he died," the sergeant major continued. "Barely older than you, young Velthari. He left behind a wife, a 6-month-old daughter, and dreams of becoming a teacher after the war ended. Zixtal found himself drawn into the story despite himself. Why did he fight if he had so much to live for? Because if he hadn't fought, his daughter wouldn't have had a world worth living in," Williams replied simply. "The enemy his generation faced threatened everything humans valued: freedom, dignity, the right to determine their own future." The display shifted to show Williams' family line through the centuries: daughter, granddaughter, great-granddaughter, each generation contributing to human society in their own way. "Every person in this lineage exists because Marcus Williams chose duty over safety," Colonel Martinez observed. "His sacrifice echoed through generations." "But he was just one soldier among millions," Ricksman pointed out, trying to grasp the scale of what they were discussing. "How can individual choices matter so much?" Sergeant Major Williams smiled, the expression transforming her weathered features. "Computer, expand the display to show parallel lineages. All soldiers KIA Normandy campaign." The holographic family tree suddenly branched into thousands of similar patterns, each representing a fallen soldier whose sacrifice had allowed future generations to exist and thrive. Collective impact. Elder Kesrel breathed, her scales shifting to the gold of sudden understanding. Each individual choice, seemingly small, contributing to something immeasurably larger. "Exactly," General Hayes confirmed. "And that's what the guard at the tomb represents. He stands watch not just for one unknown soldier, but for every human who made the ultimate sacrifice. His discipline honors them all." Zixtal felt overwhelmed by the scope of what he was learning. But how can one person carry the weight of so much history, so much responsibility? "Because he's not carrying it alone," Sergeant Rodriguez answered. "Every guard who has ever stood that post shares the burden. Every visitor who shows proper respect adds their strength. Every generation that remembers keeps the promise alive." Williams approached a different display showing the changing of the guard ceremony. "Watch this. Computer, show this morning's guard change." The hologram depicted the precise, almost ritualistic process by which one guard transferred responsibility to another. Every movement was choreographed with military precision. Every gesture carried symbolic meaning. "See how the outgoing guard inspects his replacement?" Williams pointed out. "He's not just checking uniform standards. He's ensuring that the next guardian is prepared to uphold the same commitment, maintain the same discipline, honor the same memory." "The torch passes from one guardian to the next," Colonel Martinez added. an unbroken chain of commitment stretching back decades. No matter what happens in the outside world, wars, politics, social changes, the vigil continues. Zixtal watched the ceremony with new eyes, beginning to see the deeper symbolism he had missed before. When I disrupted the guard's routine, you threatened to break a chain that has remained unbroken for over 60 years, General Hayes confirmed. Not through malice, but through ignorance. That's why the reaction was so strong. Elder Kesserel's scales had shifted to the deep blue of profound respect. In our culture, we honor our ancestors through celebration and remembrance rituals. But this is active honor. Living commitment. The dead live as long as the living remember them, Sergeant Major Williams quoted. That's not just philosophy for humans. It's operational doctrine. Our fallen continue to serve as examples, as inspiration, as reminders of what we're capable of when necessity demands everything. But what happens when the last human who personally knew these soldiers dies? Zixtal asked, grappling with concepts foreign to his culture. How can you honor people you never met? The same way you can love family members born after you die, Rodriguez replied. Some connections transcend personal experience. When I stand guard, I feel the presence of every soldier who ever served, even those from centuries before my birth. The room fell silent as the implications settled over the group. Zixtal looked around at the thousands of faces in the photographs, each representing a life freely given for principles that outlasted the individual. I need to apologize again, he said quietly, not just for taking the cap, but for misunderstanding everything it represented. Acknowledgement is the first step, Williams agreed. But true understanding requires something more. Zixtal's scales had remained a steady, thoughtful blue for several minutes now, longer than he had maintained any single emotional state since arriving on Earth. What kind of something more? Sergeant Major Williams gestured toward the window overlooking the cemetery grounds. Come with me. Let me show you something that might help you understand the true scope of what you witnessed today. The group followed her outside, where the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the endless rows of white markers. Williams led them along a different path than they had taken earlier, this one winding through sections of the cemetery that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. Every marker you see represents not just a death, but a choice, Williams explained as they walked. Computer, access my personal interface. Display augmented reality overlay for section 60. Suddenly, holographic images appeared above many of the grave markers, photos of the people buried beneath, along with brief summaries of their lives in service. Zixtal stopped walking, overwhelmed by the sudden presence of so many individual stories. A young woman who had been a combat medic, saving lives under fire until an explosion claimed her own. A pilot who had crashed his damaged ship in an empty field rather than risk civilian casualties. A communications specialist who had stayed at her post during an enemy attack, calling in coordinates for evacuation ships until the building collapsed around her. They were all so young, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Most soldiers are, Colonel Martinez confirmed. They make these choices at an age when most beings are still figuring out what they want to do with their lives. Elder Kesserel approached one of the markers, her ancient frame moving slowly across the grass. This one was only 17 standard years old, barely past juvenile stage for our species. Seaman Apprentice Johnson, Williams read from the marker, died protecting a refugee convoy during the Outer Rim evacuation. He had been in service for exactly 93 days. Zixtal felt something breaking inside his chest, a tight, painful sensation he couldn't identify. 93 days. He barely had time to learn his duties, and he died performing them. He had enough time to understand what they meant, Sergeant Rodriguez said softly. That's what training is for, not just to teach skills but to instill values, to help young people understand what's worth dying for. They continued walking, and Zixtal found himself reading every marker they passed. The accumulated weight of so many individual sacrifices was staggering. Each person had been someone's child, someone's friend, someone's hope for the future. In Velthari culture, we celebrate those who achieve great things. Scientists, artists, leaders who advance our civilization, he said slowly. But these people, most of them never had the chance to achieve anything outside of their service. Their service was their achievement, Williams replied. They gave others the freedom to become scientists, artists, and leaders. They chose to be the foundation that others could build upon. The group paused at a section where fresh flowers had been placed on many graves. Some arrangements were clearly recent, while others showed signs of regular maintenance over months or years. Family members? Rixvin asked. Some, Colonel Martinez confirmed. Others are placed by strangers who want to ensure no grave goes unremembered. There are volunteer organizations dedicated to maintaining these sites, keeping the memories alive. Zixtal watched a human couple placing flowers on a grave dated nearly 20 years ago. The elderly pair moved with obvious difficulty, but their care in arranging the memorial was evident. Excuse me. Elder Kesserall approached the couple. Was this person known to you personally? The elderly woman looked up with tears in her eyes. Our grandson. He died in the Proxima incident, that border skirmish with the hegemony forces. He was supposed to come home for his birthday the following week. Her husband placed a gnarled hand on the marker. 20 years ago next month. But we visit every week. Sometimes we tell him about his nieces and nephews he never got to meet. Sometimes we just sit here and remember. Zixtal felt that strange tightness in his chest intensifying. 20 years and you still mourn him? We don't mourn, the woman corrected gently. We remember, we honor. We keep his story alive so that his sacrifice continues to have meaning. As the couple moved on to tend other graves, Zixtal realized something profound was happening to his understanding of existence itself. His species celebrated individual achievement and advancement, but these humans had created something that transcended individual identity. The guard at the tomb, he said suddenly. When he stands there, he's not just one person. He's connected to all of this. He gestured at the vast cemetery around them. Now you're beginning to understand, General Hayes said approvingly. His discipline isn't just personal commitment. It's a visible symbol of humanity's promise to never forget, never abandon, never stop honoring those who gave everything. Williams led them to a small amphitheater where several benches faced a memorial wall covered in names. This is the memorial for soldiers whose remains were never recovered. Missing in action, lost in space, died in places too dangerous for retrieval. Thousands of names covered the dark stone surface, arranged chronologically by conflict. Zixtal approached the wall and ran one clawed finger along the carved letters. All of these people, they're like the unknown soldier in the tomb. Exactly, Rodriguez confirmed. Every name here represents someone whose family never had closure, never had a grave to visit, never had physical remains to bury. But they're not forgotten. Elder Kesserall studied the wall with obvious emotion. In our culture, proper burial rituals are essential for honoring the dead. How do you cope with such uncertainty? We create certainty where we can, Williams replied. We may not know where their bodies rest, but we know their names, their stories, their sacrifices. That knowledge becomes their monument. Zixtal found himself searching the wall for specific names, reading service records and final mission details. Each entry told a story of someone who had vanished in the line of duty, leaving behind only memories and questions. This is why the tomb guard's duty is so important, he realized aloud. He represents all of them, the known and unknown, the found and lost, the remembered and forgotten. And why disrupting that duty was such a serious offense, General Hayes added. You weren't just interfering with one soldier's routine. You were threatening the integrity of humanity's most sacred promise. The young Velthari turned away from the wall, his scales now shifting to colors Elder Kesserall had never seen before. Deep purples and blues mixed with silver threads that seemed to reflect the memorial lighting. I think I understand now, Zixtal said, his voice carrying a new weight. But understanding something and truly comprehending it, those might be different things. How do I process what I've learned here? The same way every human processes it, Sergeant Major Williams replied. One day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of honor at a time. But I'm not human. I don't have your cultural framework, your instincts for sacrifice and service. Honor isn't species-specific, Rodriguez observed. It's about recognizing what matters more than your own comfort, convenience, or pride. You've taken the first step by acknowledging your mistake. Zixtal looked back toward the tomb, barely visible in the distance. What would be an appropriate way to show genuine respect? Not just an apology, but something that demonstrates I understand what I interfered with. The humans exchanged glances, and Elder Kesserall saw something pass between them, a silent communication that spoke of decisions being made. That, said General Hayes slowly, is a very good question. General Hayes studied Zixtal for a long moment, his experienced eyes reading something in the young alien's posture that hadn't been there before. Sergeant Rodriguez, what do you think would be appropriate? The guard considered the question carefully. Sir, the young Velthari has demonstrated genuine remorse and understanding. Perhaps a gesture of service rather than mere apology? What kind of service? Zixtal asked immediately, his scales brightening with genuine interest. Sergeant Major Williams smiled, the expression carrying decades of wisdom. The cemetery maintains a program for visitors who want to participate in memorial maintenance. Cleaning markers, placing flags, maintaining flower arrangements. It's volunteer work, but it requires dedication and respect. I would be honored to participate, Zixtal said without hesitation. But I want to do more than just physical labor. I want to understand, really understand, the stories of the people remembered here. Elder Kesrel's scales shifted to the gold of pride and surprise. This was not the same arrogant youth who had boarded the shuttle that morning. That's a significant commitment, Colonel Martinez warned. Learning those stories means confronting the reality of sacrifice in ways that might be difficult for your species to process. My species needs to learn these lessons, Zixtal replied firmly. I'm not the only young Velthari who thinks humans are weak because they lost military engagements. If I can understand the truth, maybe I can teach others. General Hayes nodded approvingly. Very well. Sergeant Rodriguez, would you be willing to serve as a mentor for our young friend here? It would be my privilege, sir. Over the following hours, Zixtal found himself engaged in activities he had never imagined participating in. Under Rodriguez's careful guidance, he learned to clean memorial markers with the proper reverence, to arrange flowers in traditional patterns, and to read the significance of various military decorations and symbols. But more importantly, he began to learn the stories. Private Chen died aged 21, saved his entire squad by throwing himself on an enemy explosive device. Rodriguez explained as they tended to one particular grave, left behind a wife and twin daughters he never got to meet. Zixtal carefully arranged fresh flowers around the marker, his movements now deliberate and respectful. How do the daughters honor his memory? One became a doctor, the other a teacher. They both speak at military academies about the importance of service and sacrifice. His legacy lives through their choices. As the day progressed, other visitors to the cemetery began to notice the unusual sight of a young Velthari working alongside human veterans. Some stopped to ask questions, leading to conversations that further deepened Zixtal's understanding. My great-uncle is buried here, one elderly human told him. Died in the same battle as your Sergeant Rodriguez's unit, actually. Never met him personally, but my family raised me on stories of his courage. Zixtal paused in his work to listen, and the human continued. He used to write letters home about the beauty of distant stars, about his hope that someday all species could explore space together peacefully. His death helped make that possible. How? The young Velthari asked. Because his sacrifice and thousands like it convinced the Velthari Empire that humans would never surrender their ideals. That forced them to negotiate instead of simply conquering. The peace we have now was built on the foundation of their willingness to die for it. When Elder Kesserel found him hours later, Zixtal was sitting quietly beside the tomb, watching the current guard maintain his vigil. His scales had settled into a pattern she had never seen before, deep blue touched with silver and gold, a combination that spoke of profound respect mixed with newfound wisdom. It's time to return to the shuttle, she said gently. Our schedule requires us to depart soon. I want to request a modification to our itinerary, Zixtal said without taking his eyes off the guard. I want to spend tomorrow here as well, learning more stories, helping maintain more memorials. That would mean missing the technology demonstrations at the human research facilities. Technology can be learned from databases and educational programs, Zixtal replied. This is something that can only be learned by being present, by participating, by showing the respect these people earned. As they prepared to leave, Sergeant Rodriguez approached with something in his hands, a small pin bearing the symbol of the Tomb Guard unit. This is normally reserved for active guards, he explained, but I spoke with my commander. He's authorized me to present you with an honorary pin, recognizing your service today and your commitment to understanding our traditions. Zixtal accepted the pin with hands that trembled slightly. I don't deserve this, You earned it, Rodriguez corrected. Not through military service, but through something equally valuable. The courage to admit error and the commitment to learn from it. General Hayes joined them for the presentation. You've demonstrated something important today, young Zixtel. You've shown that honor and respect aren't limited by species barriers. Your people and mine have more in common than we sometimes realize. As the Velthari group prepared to board their shuttle, Zixtal took one last look at the tomb where a new guard had taken position. The soldier's discipline was absolute, his commitment unwavering, his presence a living promise to the dead. I'll be back tomorrow, Zixtal called out softly, knowing the guard couldn't acknowledge him, but hoping the words would somehow reach those he was honoring. On the shuttle, Rixavan approached his clutchmate with obvious curiosity. You've changed today. Your scales, your posture, even the way you speak, it's all different. I learned something important, Zixtal replied, carefully pinning the honorary guard symbol to his clothing. I learned that strength isn't always about winning battles or demonstrating superiority. Sometimes the greatest strength is in keeping promises to people who can't reward you for it. Elder Kesserall settled beside them as the shuttle lifted off from Earth's surface. And what will you do with this knowledge when we return home? Zixtal looked out the viewport at the receding planet, his scales shifting to determined gold. I'm going to teach other young Velthari what I learned here. About human honor, about sacrifice, about the kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself. Your father may not approve of this new perspective, she warned gently. Then I'll help him understand too, Zixtal replied with quiet confidence. The same way these humans helped me understand. With patience, with stories, and with the kind of respect that honors both the living and the dead. As Earth disappeared behind them, Zixtal touched the guard pin one more time. In his mind, he could still see Sergeant Rodriguez maintaining his perfect vigil, still feel the weight of all those stories he had learned, still sense the presence of countless souls who had chosen service over safety. He was no longer the same arrogant youth who had mocked a human soldier that morning. He had become something new, a bridge between species, a teacher of hard-earned wisdom, and a keeper of stories that deserved to be remembered across the galaxy. The transformation was complete, but the real work was just beginning.